The anime did not do this justice, but I got you. Let's fix God of High School. So, where do you start reading God of High School after you finish the anime? The answer is Chapter 1. Let's get into it. Episode 1. Now, the anime does start out the same way as the manhwa, with this guy, Mujin Park. He gets some news over the phone he's not a fan of and then sets the tone for this series by remotely crushing an island. Immediately following that, though, the anime jumps straight into Chapter 4. So what did we miss? Here we meet our protagonist, Mori Jin, and we can see he's quite the fighter. It's a small detail, but I love when they include records like this. It's like when we get character intros in, say, Baki or Yu Yu Hakusho.
Maybe you should stop picking so many fights with Urameshi, huh?
That makes 0 wins and 156 losses.
He goes on to explain to us why he's so good at fighting, and how his grandfather's training basically turned him into One Punch Man. And here we're introduced to Judge R, who Morty is ignoring until he shows off how strong he is too. R invites him to participate in the God of High School, and Morty takes this as an invitation to a fight. A fight he actually loses, and this brings him to 1 loss. Now he's interested. Now let's meet Tae Han, who is working extremely hard. He has 2 jobs to try to help cover his friend's medical bills, which his friend really wishes he wouldn't, and tries to downplay how bad his condition's gotten. The next day, he has to deal with some clowns at school, but he has such a chill demeanor it doesn't really faze him. These clowns do fill us in, though, that he's a local fighting legend. Later, while he's at work, we meet Judge Q, and he's here with the proposition to invite him to the God of High School tournament. So of course he wants money for his friend, but we get some insight into his character here because he asks specifically for how much he would need. And Q tells him if it is for his friend, if he won, they could cure him. And Dewi does give this some serious thought later, but decides it's not worth it. Who could possibly win that? Back at school though, the clowns are antagonizing him again, and this time they overstep some boundaries, so he decides to lay them out. Q was keeping some tabs on him though and witnessed this beatdown, and this is where Taewi agrees to participate in God of High School. And now let's meet Mirayu, who seems like quite the klutz on first impression. And then the manhwa gives us fair warning that she's cringe and cheesy. And then we get like a K-drama setup of her friends asking why she likes her boyfriend, to which we can see that she admires strength and he's the strongest in the school. Later on a walk, we see the 2 surrounded by a group of thugs. Looking pretty noble here, he tells Mira to run, which she does. He stays behind to fight some thugs, but then she runs into some herself. And we see her boyfriend is struggling in his fight, but she made quick work of the ones who dared challenge her. She essentially says he's a weakling for struggling to beat such weaklings, which prompts them to attack her. Which is a mistake, but we do get to see a named attack here. And a brief look into her lore reveals that her admiration for strength comes from the desire to find a good seed to carry on the Moonlight sword style. And speaking of swords, she decides that the remaining thugs aren't worth hers, and decides to come at them with no sword style to literally snap their necks.
Prepare yourself. God will attack.
And this brutality was witnessed by Judge O, who cordially invites her to participate in God of High School. And back to Morty, we see he's still standing, and he tells R he plans to use his feet now. And the very idea that a Taekwondo practitioner punched his way to 300 victories really sets this tone for me. Now that he's acknowledged R's strength, he delivers a swift kick, which R blocks. Later we see R update Mujin Park that the invitations had been distributed. And we also see that Morty's kick shattered his arm, and that is so cool. That's a perfect way to acknowledge the distance while still letting Mori flex how powerful he is. And now we're synced back up with the anime, so you can get a feel for what I mean. And I like the bike scene, so with the constraints, that's perfect. An anime can be adapted in various orders, so as long as you make sure you sprinkle that in somewhere where it'll make sense, that's fine. But if you don't, it turns into more of an ad than an adaptation. And I like the character intros. We get so much development later down the line that I think this helps with the payoff. And I think Smash just influenced how much I like seeing invitation scenes. Anyway, like I said, with the constraints, fair enough. There is some cut content from this scene, but I mean, you get a feel for the characters. And that brings us to the preliminaries, and this is where the anime shines. The fight scenes are insane, shout out to Mappa, and they honestly do a decent job here highlighting who's really important and the skills that they have. And then eventually we get a late entry, Monsuk Gong. And he's definitely one to watch. Before the episode ends, it teases his clash with Mori. And I don't want the whole thing to be like the source material has more information, like duh, of course, right? But I will leave you with this panel. Episode 2. Now at the start of this episode, they do try to backtrack to sprinkle in some detail, but the way they do it is disorienting. That said though, they do a decent job of showing the way that our main characters interact with each other, as well as the implication of the nanotechnology being able to help Taewi's friend. So I'll start from the tournament. And funny enough, they do port over all the one-shots, and they even use one as a vehicle to reference how Mori has just been punching a lot of people. And speaking of vehicles, this is where the anime more formally introduces Gamdo Go. And I say vehicle because their interactions so far give you some insight into Mori's character. Anyway, time for the first match that matters, Gamdo Go versus Monsuk Gong. And you know what? Credit where it's due. I have no notes. Gamdo is initially winning, but once Monsuk sheds his restraints, it becomes very one-sided in his favor. And no skipping details, we get all the brutality and the context to go with it. And here we get the distinction that he's using Northern-style ITF Taekwondo. They make it a point to explain that it is exceptionally brutal, and think of it like the Satsui no Hado of Taekwondo. Monsuk has Gamdo literally on the ropes, but he's not ready to give up just yet. He goes for a named attack here, the Yin-Yang 5-element strike. And it's worth noting that Monsuk knew how to counter the wave motion, so despite his style being more militaristic with killing intent, he's not going full unga bunga. Now he starts goading Gamdo and telling him to beg for mercy. And when he refuses, Monsuk is prepared to use excessive force, and this is where Mori steps in. I will say I like the lead-in more in the manhwa, as well as the power level increase being explicitly shown. Oh, and here we also find out that our announcer, Shimbong Sa, is blind. Which we also find that out later in the anime, but I think it's cool to show here since he's been commentating these matches so perfectly. Anyway, after being kicked away by Mori, Monsuk refuses to stay down. And the way the rest of this plays out, I'm not mad at per se. The anime elaborates way less, but it kind of gives you like a real-time version, if that makes sense. Like you get the real-time animation of some pretty key visuals, and that's not bad. We get the triple kick and the crowd hypes up Mori. Episode 3. Starting out, we see that both Gamdo and Monsuk are unfit to fight. The cut content here is that the manhwa more explicitly breaks down Re-Taekwondo, as well as the similarities between Mori and Taejin Jin. For example, these panels. And after that, we get something entirely cut, a fight between Q and R. And it's cool to see a sample of what they're capable of. Their limiters always show level 1, so they're good at power suppression. And it helps with their characterizations too, like O not wanting to stop them because he's off the clock. Mujin Park does want to stop them, even flooring O as collateral. Here we learn his real name is Mubong Park, which people online will definitely remind you of. So, now he's that. So Mubong discusses Re-Taekwondo with Judge S, who I'll just introduce here because he's had a lot of dialogue up to this point, but hasn't really been in the anime. And Mubong confirms that the Six would be very interested in this. The Six are the most skilled fighters in the country, and Mubong is one of them. And despite that power, we see that the Six got washed by Taejin. S was there as well, not as a member, but as an apprentice. And some panels here I really like is this one that wants you to zero in on Mubong's personality, and how there's implied money scaling amongst the Six. Anyway, they want Morty to admit his connection, which is less of an interrogation and more of a proud, yep, that's my grandpa, followed by a very straightforward doxing, like, yeah, he lives here. And that brings us to our next fight, Mirayu versus Mison Ma. And this is handled well too. The way I would describe it is that they moved some of the pre-fight dialogue mid-match. That way they can break up the action scenes and focus on some key visuals. So we know Mira is here to revive her family's sword style, but Misonna has some very different objectives. All the commissioners are her type, and she wants them in her harem. And don't let this gag wish for simps fool you. She's quite strong. And really tanky. And as a fighting game fan, I gotta say I love this style of wrestler. Her being so tanky makes it so a wooden sword is ineffective against her, and she disarms Mira after parrying an attack. But as we've seen, Mira is no stranger to no sword style. Okay, and here is an example of where a cut happens. You don't lose a lot, but still, this context would be nice. Misun sees an opportunity to win, but realizes what it would take to do that. Wanting it less is still an L though, so Mira wins. And a cool aside here is that this is a perfect example of in-character versus bloodlusted, right? And I think this says a lot about both of these characters as fighters. After this fight, they sprinkle in some of Dewi's backstory as well as showing Mori eating the fruit. But we already had that foreshadowed better in the manhwa, so I'll go straight to the next fight from here. And that's Dewi Han versus Sung Chol Baek. And Sung Chol Baek is highly intelligent and analytical. His dad was also a detective and he saw him as a hero, so with his fighting style, let's just call him Batman. Living up to the Batman name, his pursuit of knowledge was relentless, and it makes him insanely efficient as a fighter. And the anime kinda makes reference to his enlightenment by having him call out Dewi's attack patterns and then striking open vitals. And then on Dewi's side, this fight does a good job of showing and not telling his characterizations. So as a broken record, they pay excellent attention to key visuals, but that context would be nice. And even though I get what they were going for because I have context, this would lead you to believe that he's just Naruhodo pushes up glasses anime man. However, this fight is so cool, and we get the first appearance of the Kyokushin secret arts of the four guardian gods. And we get through 3 of those before the fight is over. Dewi wins. And much like the last fight, we have some cut content that doesn't change the outcome but is still cool. After this fight, the anime jumps straight into the next, and the manhwa sets it up here, but the anime has been sprinkling it throughout the episode. So this will be the setup of the fight between Morty and Q, and the one thing I want to highlight from the manhwa is how much Taejin is just hyping Morty up. That's so cool. Oh, and speaking of him, following this, we get a little sneak peek into that lore I mentioned earlier with him versus the Six. And in that fight, he took someone's arm. Oh, and like 10% of Korea got destroyed, I guess. And that arm belonged to the Divine Doctor, who seems to be a bit tied up, which he's ready to not be, so he reaches out to Mori, who completely ignores him. He is on a mission to find some food and ends up eating the sage fruit. Upon finding out that Doc has no other food, Morty is literally prepared to just leave, but gets prompted to introduce himself. And after doing so, gets pretty bored. He's very uninterested in the real reason God of High School is being held. After some pleading, he agrees to let the doctor go, but he needs a password first. He hears that there's a J sound involved, so he tries his own name, and when that doesn't work, he tries his grandfather's, and that does work. When the Divine Doctor learns about this connection though, he instantly attacks Morty. But Morty manages to counter just in time to stop this puncture technique from reaching his heart. And the doc is impressed, but he also implies that the fruit might kill Morty instead, so he leaves this up to fate. Morty waking up is when we see that he's running late for his fight with Q, and we sync back up here. So despite interfering with a match, the conditions here are that if Morty can knock Q down at all, he can participate in the rest of God of High School. And he's noticeably injured, but he does just that. And him doing so is so crazy, but from a spectator perspective, this was anticlimactic. Lucky for them though, Q is pretty motivated and takes this opportunity to start the fight back up. And the manhwa draws this out more. The fight between them is pretty cool with Morty having the upper hand, and it's clear Q has to get serious. But once the Joker makes its appearance, that's a wrap. And while this was going on, we got a bit of a clash between Mubong and the Divine Doctor. And in that clash, we got some exposition about the fruit and why the Divine Doctor was chained up in the first place. These fruits, or divine pellets, can bring out your latent potential, with the caveat being that if you cannot control your subconscious, you will likely die. After their convo, we see them enter the arena where Morty is laid out by Q. They presume him to be dead, but are shocked that that's not the case. And this scene really conveys the tension because R lays him back out at the slightest movement, even though he was just saying he's hungry. Later on, we see the Divine Doctor doing some actual doctoring. He performed acupuncture to aid in Morty's recovery, but he noticed that the divine pellets aren't affecting him normally. And parallel to all this, we see that Tajin is approached by some shadowy figures. They seem to want him to join something, but he pretty quickly dismisses them. Episode 4. Following Morty's match with Q, the God of High School Tournament goes on a week-long hiatus. Mira seems to have an admirer who has a much cooler intro in the manhwa. He casually borrows her sword to stop a thief, but this just shows that he's capable of doing so, which has her interested as well. And this is one of those moments, right? If you're not gonna elaborate, why do we even have this scene? Why do we have these plot lines? Just skip us a week to the tournament. It's no big deal, right? Anyway, her admirer turns out to be the chairman of a very successful company, and he proposes to her on the spot. Following this, we get more of Mira's backstory, centered around her uncle this time, who is so attentive despite being super busy. We then see her admirer more formally ask for her uncle's blessing, but he says that's not up to him, that's her decision. And while that's true, seeing her uncle struggling to pay these bills kind of pressures her into saying yes. When they get the news, the guys come to check out the details, and she's not getting married just yet, but she's not competing in the tournament anymore. Morty reminds her that winning would land her a wish, but she's clearly uncomfortable with the uncertainty. Later, we actually see that she is getting married, but they just wanted to keep it under wraps. And here we get more of her backstory. Her strong desire for strength comes from wanting to carry out her father's will. But about that wedding, her uncle can see that her heart's not in it, and he wants them to call it off, even if he has to cover the cost himself. And this causes her fiancé to drop the mask. And he has ties to that shadowy, cult-like organization that we saw earlier. Beyond being after Mira herself because she can draw out its power, he was after her sword. And in context, we get a glimpse back of him admiring her sword on first introduction, not her. And really quick, even in the manhwa, this pacing was extremely fast. So I imagine for someone who watched the anime first, this had to be exceptionally jarring, right? Let me know. Anyway, the anime does a decent job of conveying her cousin's concern for her marrying not for love. To elaborate further, in the manhwa, Mira does confirm that this is more about her uncle's debts. And enter Wedding Crasher Morty. Okay, but for anything after this, I can't stress this enough, the anime pacing on this scene is break your neck fast. I have full context and I don't know what's going on. There is some cut content here. It's Morty and Dewi discussing all the nuances of how much it must suck to be getting married at 17, the sacrifices that go along with that, and etc. And Morty says he won't be violent, he's just gonna try to do some convincing. It's a pretty solid scene and contextualizes some future events quite well. Sucks that it's cut. So we see pacifist Morty trying his best to break through, but we also see that Dewi did show up because he sees his friend in him. And we see him be super supportive as he quite literally gives Morty the push he needs to break through. And following the non-violent act of pushing, now they'll use their words to get through. And fair enough, I'd move too. And here Dewi stops the groom to give Morty a chance to talk to the bride. And they translate his actions decently. It was just so much more impactful in the manhwa. I don't think they needed to adjust this part. Anyway, Morty approaches Mira and asks her if she's marrying him of her own volition, basically. And for a series I say is largely character-driven, it hurts this scene in particular to not have the full context. So why do we have this? Mira says she's different because of the obligation to uphold her family's swordsmanship. And Morty acknowledges that he doesn't know what that pressure is like, but he still wants her to live for herself. And she reflects on it a bit, but her uncle wants her to live for herself too. And honestly, his reaction in the anime is, dare I say, better, but it doesn't have that same payoff. And on the subject of payoff, Mira decides that she doesn't want to get married, which prompts Morty to ask if he can beat these guys up now. But she's gonna clean up her own mess. And quick aside, because this One Piece panel comes right after, I haven't been explicitly pointing it out, but I love the humor in this series. Anyway, Mira very respectfully says that she cannot go through with this marriage, which triggers the full mask off from the groom. He starts ranting about his status, about commoners, blah blah blah, and then he goes in to attack her, which she fully stops with bare hand style. She comments about how she has terrible luck with men, and he takes this about as well as you might think, and sneak attacks her. He does display Chariok here, but is completely outclassed, and Mira makes quick work of him. Unfortunately though, he does manage to steal the sword by like ninja flashbanging out. But Mira seems oddly at peace with it, and as they're heading back to the stadium, her uncle comments that she looks happy with them. Following this, the anime sprinkles in some of Dewey's backstory and his reason for joining the tournament. The manhwa more so shows that he's conflicted about their upcoming fight, sort of regretting that he went to the wedding in the first place. Later on, we see a conversation between Mira and Mori, and the biggest takeaway here is that he knows that her wound won't heal immediately. He says that the wounds he got from Q and the Divine Doctor didn't heal even with the nanotech. He wraps up the conversation by saying he's not going to watch the fight, but wishes both of them good luck. And that brings us to the first round of the semi-finals, Dewi Han versus Mira Yu. The manhwa gives a full lead-in and showcases their stats, but when it comes to the fighting, the anime is pretty brutal. There's much more emphasis on blood, and she gets like 2-shot in the manhwa, but dragging this out is I guess their way of making up for the missing context. Dewi wins. After this, he says he'd never considered them as friends, but come on, who's he trying to convince?
See you in the finals.